Good evening. My name is Alan Glover. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Museum of Television and Radio's first annual Television Documentary Festival. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be taking a look at the art and craft of the television documentary with a series of screenings that we selected from the past 18 months. We're also going to be showcasing several premieres, as well as a retrospective on the work of John Alpert. The film that we're saluting tonight is called Lenny Bruce, Swear to Tell the Truth. It was written, directed, and produced by Robert B. Weide. It's a winner of an Emmy Award and was also nominated for an Academy Award. The film had its television debut on home box office last summer, and we'd like to thank HBO and Sheila Nevins for helping us make this event possible. After the screening, we're going to have a reception upstairs in the Spielberg Gallery. We're very pleased tonight to have with us the director of the film, Bob Weide, as well as one of the many people interviewed in the film, Nat Hentoff, who's a columnist for the Village Voice. And they're going to join us after the screening for a Q&A. Bob Weide has been a longtime friend of the museum. He was a big help to us last year when we produced our own exhibition on Lenny Bruce. He directed his first film in 1982 at the age of 22, called The Marx Brothers in a Nutshell. 2 years later, he produced and directed Great Stand-Ups, 60 Years of Laughter for HBO. In 1986, he received an Emmy Award for W.C. Fields' Straight Up. And 3 years later, he produced and directed Mort Saul, The Loyal Opposition. He's also the producer and screenwriter of Mother Night, which is based on the Kurt Vonnegut novel, and he's been involved in numerous projects for HBO, including a series that he's currently making with Larry David. He's a great award-winning documentarian. We're very happy to have him here with us tonight. Please welcome Bob Weide.
Did you people all leave work early, or do you not have jobs? Yes, to both. It was a great reception today coming into New York. It was very nice. I appreciate it. I thought the blocking off the traffic and all that, it was a little overdone, but still I appreciate it. The paparazzi were a little rough on me walking down 5th, but I survived it. I don't need to say much about this beforehand. It's pretty self-explanatory. I will do this. I like to do this when we have public screenings. I like to take a little straw poll just for my own amusement, and I want to ask you, we'll break this up into 3 categories. How many of you here tonight know very little to nothing about Lenny Bruce? You know his name, you know maybe a little something, but very little. Okay, a few hands. How many people are pretty familiar with him, somewhat familiar with his story, know some of the routines? And a lot. How many people are rabid Lenny aficionados? Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay, well, I think there's something in this film for all 3 of those groups tonight, but I'm always curious to see what the breakdown is. I want to thank the museum for doing this tonight. This is really a big kick to see the film with a group. It's sort of ironic that I'd put on a suit and tie tonight, considering that Lenny wore his denims when he was on trial, refused to put on the blue suit, because he always said that, of course, the guy wearing the blue suit was the criminal. What else do I want to say? That's really basically it. Thank you to HBO. Hey, there's Jeff, my co-editor, Jeff Bart's right here. That's it. Thank you to HBO. Thank you to the museum. Enjoy the show. Stick around afterwards for a lively Q&A session, and you can ask anything you want. And even if you aren't sticking around for the Q&A, I ask that you stick around for the closing credits, because there's a little dedication at the very end of the credits that is meaningful in some way I'd like you to see. Thank you for being here. Hope you enjoy the evening.
I would like to reintroduce the director of the film, Robert B. Weide. Nat Hentoff has been a staff writer at the Village Voice since 1958. His views on journalistic responsibility and the rights of Americans to think, write, and speak freely are expressed in his weekly column for The Voice. And he is acknowledged as one of the foremost authorities in the area of First Amendment defense. He has written extensively on law, civil rights, politics, the Supreme Court, race politics, civil liberties, and jazz. We're very happy to have him with us tonight. Please welcome Nat Hentoff.
Lenny winds up bringing Nat and me together about once a year now, isn't that it? I never get to see him if it weren't for Lenny.
I've seen all the documentaries. I've been in every one of them. This is by far the real documentary.
Thanks.
Why don't we start off by talking about the end of the film? There's a controversial footage of Lenny on the floor in his basement, naked, and then there's a choice of your song over the closing credits,
Oh, I fought the law.
and the law won.
Yeah.
So
well,
looking
it
back
did and it
35
didn't.
years later, did the law actually win?
You know what I found out just recently is that in the purest sense, technically, you know, his New York conviction was never really overturned. It was really his co-defendant, Howard Solomon, whose conviction was overturned. And for all intents and purposes, Lenny's conviction in all practical terms, but they never literally overturned his conviction. And I actually know somebody who's working on trying to get
I suppose if he was still alive, though, Marty Garbus or some other lawyer could have specifically pointed out, you can't bust a guy if the owner of the club isn't busted.
Yeah,
Isn't,
right,
you know,
right.
yeah.
And it sort of became, in some ways, academic after Lenny's death, I guess. But it'd be nice to see that done just for the for the official record. But in any event, well, I guess the song was kind of ironic, but it sort of looked like they won. But then, you know, enough time goes by, and I guess the fact that, I mean, I have mixed feelings about it because now performers can get up there and say whatever they want. Unfortunately, most of them don't have much to say, so it's a double-edged sword. But with regard to the footage at the end, it was a bit of an ethical dilemma for me because I hated that the photographers were allowed to come in and shoot this footage of Lenny lying on the floor, and yet here I was making use of the footage that they shot. But I thought the impact of really seeing what was going on that last night was more important than that. A point that was made in an earlier cut that just wound up being cut out of the final version for no reason other than we had to wrap up the film. It was going to go on too long. Was that Lenny's buddy, John Judnick, who lived with him, when he was the one who found the body, Lenny was on the toilet when he died, so his pants were around his ankles. And John, knowing that the police and various people in the press would probably show up, actually dressed him, pulled his pants up, just, you know, out of respect. And when the cops came, they actually undressed him again for the photographers so that they could photograph him naked as sort of the final
I would
humiliation.
point out that I don't think the cops would have been that solicitous of the press if it had not been Lenny Bruce.
Oh, sure.
Because the undercurrent of all of this was it wasn't only the DAs, sometimes the church indirectly out to get him, it was the police.
Yeah.
And I thought that section was very important. First of all, it shows the ghoulishness of the press sometimes, but also this was a tragedy without any kind of hyperbolic language. And to see him lying there, and to see this predatory group of photographers, it was Dostoevskian. It wasn't Kafka. It was much deeper, or much more vicious than that. It was Dostoevsky.
Bobby mentioned in your introduction the film was 12 years in the making. I wonder if you can tell us how the project got its start and why it took so long.
In '84, I did a project for HBO on the history of stand-up comedy, starting in vaudeville to the then present. And I'd been a Lenny Bruce fanatic since high school. That's when all these obsessions took place. It was the Marx Brothers, and Kurt Vonnegut was my author, and Lenny was my comedian, and Woody Allen was my filmmaker. And I'd always wanted to do something on Lenny, and the show that I did for HBO in '84 is when I started to collect a lot of Lenny clips. And the problem is there's not a lot of footage of him performing because of the nature of his act. He wasn't allowed on TV that often. But in any event, through that film, I became very friendly with Lenny's mother, Sally Marr. She became like my adopted grandmother. We were very, very close. She was terrific. I miss her. And she wanted me to do something on Lenny because nothing of this nature had been done before. So sort of as a gift for her, I agreed to do it. And there was some initial seed money from PBS in the very beginning. The real holdup with this film, the 12-year thing, was really about financing. It was nothing more than that. As I ran out of the seed money, then I was out of my own pocket for about 10 years and finally managed to put together what looked for all intents and purposes like a finished show. It was really a fine cut. And that got to Sheila Nevins at HBO, and she saw what I had done up to that point and said, well, geez, what do you need to finish this? Let's get this finished and on the air. So HBO came in and gave me the money to get it finished and on the air. So if it weren't for them, it'd probably be sitting for another 13 years. I have a Kurt Vonnegut documentary now that's in year 12, and a Dick Gregory documentary that's in year 13.
Oh. Yeah, that needs to be seen, a Dick Gregory documentary.
Yeah, I'll say. Another real groundbreaker.
Yeah.
You mentioned you had trouble finding television material of Lenny Bruce.
Yeah, I mean,
Talk about, was there a difference between the stage Lenny and the television Lenny?
yeah, he did have to clean up his act for TV the few times he was on. You know, the difficulty in making this film is if you do, you know, there are the Steve Allen appearances, and some of those have been used before the airplane glue routine, and
Right.
but there just wasn't a lot, and I just really looked under every rock and behind every brick that I could find, and wound up uncovering this unaired episode from 1964, which I used in a few places, and even Steve Allen himself assumed that was destroyed and no longer in existence.
There's a footnote to the section with Lenny and me, and Lenny on Benny's. He must have forgotten that I told him I'd grown up in radio when I was 19 years old and beyond, so I had no problems doing interviews on television or radio. But he was a kind fellow, and he thought I'd have problems, so he was going to carry the show. And he did. What we didn't see was the time I had to crawl under the piano to do the interview. It was done for Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and it was shown in Canada. And the reviews from the hip places like Toronto and Montreal were reasonably okay, but the reviews from the provinces were, they're spending our tax money on this?
Yeah. So what I wound up doing for some of the routines that you have to use in a film like this to show, to show why the heat came down on him, some of the religious-oriented material, was I just pulled some audio bits off of the records and then covered that with either footage of him performing or somehow illustrating what the routine was, and that's how I got that material in. But there's not a lot of performance footage of him. The clip that we come back to a few times with the brick wall or the rock wall behind him, that was shot in '65 by a filmmaker named John Magnuson. And it's not his best performance because he really did that not to be shown theatrically, but he wanted a visual record of his act for the court because he was so tired of cops doing his act and people relying on these terrible transcripts that he wanted footage of his act, naively thinking that someone was going to screen the 60-millimeter film in a courtroom. But so he's sort of once removed from the material. He's doing his act and he's really talking about his act rather than doing it. But that does give us the one film performance of a nightclub.
I think it ought to be noted that Richard Q in this film appears a good deal more benign than he actually was. The way he conducted the trial, for example, I'll give you my own scene with Q. He started out by saying, "Is it not true, Mr. Hentoff, that you have written a biography of a convicted felon?" I said, "Yeah, his name was A.J. Musty. He was a pacifist. He was the man who got Martin Luther King involved in nonviolence, and he was convicted on a felony because he climbed over a missile bench in Nevada to protest atomic testing." And he conducted the trial that way. My favorite point of the trial, I wish there were a film of this, Dorothy Kilgallen was a very well-known national columnist at the time. She worked for the Journal American, a Hearst paper. She was Catholic, very conservative, but she thought Lenny Bruce was wonderful. In fact, she helped him when he came to New York, and he played at the Duane, I think. Right. At the trial, Q thought she was going to be a damaging witness, so he put together, like the kind of guy who did the licensing guy, who, by the way, used to work for the CIA before that job in Southeast Asia. Anyway, he put together all the words he could think of that could really shock this woman. Cocksucker, tits, ass, whatever. And he put a barrage of those words and said, "What do you think of that, Miss Kilgallen?" And she looked at her white gloves. She looked at him and said, "They're words, words, words. That's all." Still, he won the case because Murtaugh, the third judge, the black judge, would have acquitted him. But Murtaugh had this hold on the other judge. I suppose I should talk about Lenny's posthumous revenge on Q. Frank Hogan died finally, and it seemed, and I'm sure he went.
You that night.
No, I'm sure he went to his maker, and wherever that was. Q was odds on to be the next district attorney. He wanted that desperately. And I decided I was going to do something for Lenny, or at least his memory. And I did a 3-part profile of Q in the Village Voice. I talked, not for attribution, to a number of the ADAs in the office. And they told me a lot of things about Q that were not very complimentary. At the end of the series, I got a call from a man I'd never met before. I knew who he was. He had been the U.S. Attorney in New York. His name was Morgenthau. And he said, is all that stuff accurate? He said, listen, I'll show you the sources without the names. He said, you know, I hadn't thought about it, but I think I'm going to run for DA. He has been the District Attorney of New York ever since. So that's one for Lenny.
Well, I'm sure our audience has some questions they'd like to ask. Who wants to ask the first question? Yes.
I want to ask Mr. Weide, when you interviewed Q, what was his sense of irony about the fact that he's there in his pretty suit saying, motherfucker this, motherfucker that, having destroyed the man for those things? I mean, what was his sense of the passage of time that Lenny had made it possible for a man like him, or anyone, to use these words?
I didn't quite get that. Would you paraphrase it?
Talking about Q's reaction, the sense of irony that here he is now on film all these years later saying the same words.
Oh, he has no sense of irony. When I saw him at the screening of this film, and he said afterwards he was much put upon. He said it was an unfair portrait when you consider what you could have done to Q. If he has any regrets, they are not manifest. Mr. Q is about as humorless as you can come. The only person I can think of who might be more humorless is Janet Reno.
It was interesting meeting Q too, because here I was, you know, ostensibly the world's biggest Lenny Bruce fan, forming this détente with the guy who sort of put the final nail in his professional coffin, and we got along fine. He was obviously very cautious when I approached him. He knew what I could have done if I had that agenda in the editing room. I said, I really need a voice from that side of the bench because we have all these people talking about how great Lenny is. Let me get somebody from the other side. And he was non-apologetic about his role in Lenny's case. I mean, he ostensibly said there was a job to do, and these were the laws that were on the books at the time, and it was my job to enforce it and to prosecute, you know, the best that I could, and that it's a little unfair to look with contemporary eyes back to a scene in 1964. So I respected that, and we actually exchanged Christmas cards now.
Paul Krasner told me a story about Q, and I confirmed it with 2 other people. He had some of the Lenny Bruce records on Fantasy, and when he had his girlfriends over, he would play them.
This is Q, not Krasner he's talking
That's
about.
right. And when there was a Broadway play on Lenny, Q showed up backstage, sort of expecting some plaudits. So I think there are no regrets there.
Yeah. I asked him about that. Because Krasner had told me about the records, and I spoke to a woman that Q was obviously single at the time, but a woman that he dated once or twice, and she confirmed, yeah, went to her place and he put on some Lenny Bruce records. And I asked Q about that, and he said whether or not I was a fan of his or found him humorous or not had nothing to do with it. This case was not about my feelings about him.
I suppose, though, it gives you a further definition of erotica.
Are you saying that Q was using Lenny to get laid?
I'm saying it's a possibility with some probable cause to believe it could have happened. Let him sue me for libel.
Defense rests.
Yes.
Speaking of the interview, he had mentioned in his closing remarks that it wasn't his choice, that this job was handed to him, that Lenny had the choice.
But it was his choice.
Well,
you know, as the film showed, and there was one of the ADAs wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times not too long ago, about a few years ago, saying that he refused Hogan because he knew what Lenny was doing. He knew what the First Amendment was about. And Hogan went through, I think, 2 other guys before Q said, oh, yeah, I would like to take this. So the choice was his.
But if I may,
Yeah.
my question for you guys, since you were so close to the subject matter, did you feel that, at least from an initial standpoint, I think that someone who enjoyed the spotlight as much as Lenny Bruce might have actually gotten a little bit of thrill about seeing his name in the headlines as much as he did initially? Was there a critical turning point at which he discovered this is not fun to be in trouble?
Yeah,
The
that's
bad boy image got
that's-
the better of him at a certain point.
that's a pretty good insight on your part. I wouldn't say he ever enjoyed getting busted, but in the early days, I mean, the San Francisco bust, I think he was so self-assured that he would be acquitted that it was a bit of a joke. It was an expensive joke, but and then he was acquitted. And then he was acquitted in Los Angeles, and then it started to snowball, and then the Chicago bust, and then he's found guilty and sentenced to a year in jail, and now the work is drying up, and whatever money he does have is going to the lawyers, and then it stopped being funny. By the time he got to New York, it was just a drag. I mean, he knew, as I think Nat says in the film, he knew that if he was convicted in New York, where else was he going to play? So it did get ugly, and it did get very sad. But at first, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that he thought it might be good publicity, but I don't think he took it that seriously until it really got...
After his conviction, he was at a hotel in New York, the Marlton on West 8th Street, and I'd go see him fairly often. And practically every surface, the floor, the bed, the kitchen, was full of legal briefs, books on the First Amendment. He was not at all thrilled by this at all. He was totally, totally obsessed. Because he knew the law. By then he had studied the law better than a good many law students. He knew he shouldn't have been convicted. And as you showed, posthumously that was not the case. And the last time I saw him work was in San Francisco. And one of the last gigs he had. And the entire show, as you showed in the film, was about the case. Somehow he made some of it seem very funny, but he was not amused. And I saw him backstage, and he was very, very down.
Now, he was fighting for his life, and after the New York conviction, when he was holed up in his house for the last 2 years working on his appeals, I mean, he really did have this old-fashioned, almost Norman Rockwell sort of vision where he did not want to go down in history as a pornographer. He kept saying, I have a daughter. I mean, which is just, a very innocent, sort of naive point. I have a daughter. I don't want her to grow up having people talk about her father, the convicted pornographer. And he just really wanted to clear his name. He also wanted to work again.
I also want to say a note about Marty Garbus. Marty was the second chair in the case. If he'd been the first chair, even with Murtaugh, I think that maybe the case would have done differently. And this is my fault. I did not know that much about the difference at the time I didn't know between appellate lawyers and trial lawyers. Lenny said, whom should I get as a lawyer? And I suggested Ephraim London. He was one of the great appellate lawyers of our time. He had argued before the Supreme Court. He had won those cases. But he was not a tough trial lawyer with an adversary like Q. And Lenny was sitting there and he'd say, I could win maybe in the appellate court. Meanwhile, I can't work. And that's why he finally dismissed the lawyers. Marty knew what was going on, but he didn't have the power to do anything.
Yeah, he was being told by everyone, we're going to lose in the lower courts. Don't worry about the lower courts. We're going to build a record. We'll win in the appellate court. And Lenny said, I'm not going to live long enough for there to be a reversal in the appellate court. I have to win now, and I have to work. That was the big fights they always had.
Yes, sir.
And I want to ask, do you believe that the idea should be taken in the context of the era? Now, we laugh at the obscenity statutes today, but in those days they were enforced. You got to look at it, 1964.
They weren't enforced. That's the point that Jackie Gale made. I heard B.S.
There
Pulley.
are obscenity statutes. They want these...
But nobody busted B.S. Pulley. Red Fox, who was a brilliant comedian, was the dirtiest comedian I've ever heard, and nobody busted him. They went after Lenny for political and religious reasons.
It was a very selective prosecution or persecution. I think both words would apply. And that, yes, technically there were laws on the books, but they simply weren't enforced. Lenny comes into town, suddenly they decide it's time to get this guy. And by that time, he'd had such a reputation. I think the point is made in here, this was Lenny's own theory, and I think it's true, is that once you get busted in town A and then busted in town B, once you come into town C, they can't not bust you, because it makes it look like they don't care what happens in their town, and a precedent was set. But I understand your point. Yes, there were laws on the books at the time, which ironically, even Richard Q. now says, he says those obscenity laws were an abomination. They made no sense. But they were on the books, and ironically, I think it is Lenny's case and how ugly it got and the reaction to that, which you would know better than I, probably had something to do with getting those laws off the books.
Well, they still may be technically on the books in a lot of places in terms of magazines, for example. But it's interesting, the Supreme Court, which did not have a good record on this kind of obscenity stuff, very rarely does any such case come before the Supreme Court anymore. It has died down. My favorite justice, William O. Douglas, they used to have screenings at the Supreme Court of so-called obscene films.
Highly attended.
Very vigorously attended. In fact, at one point, John Harlan, who was a very good First Amendment justice, but he was going blind, and Thurgood Marshall would interpret for him what was going on. But Douglas would never go to those screenings. He said, they did not put me on this court to censor First Amendment protected speech. And finally, that may have permeated. I think even Scalia these days might come to that conclusion. But what Lenny did, obviously, was to open the door for every comic sense. And it's not very comforting to him, obviously, but this was a seminal case because I think your film has had a lot to do with it too, that it would be very hard now for a DA to bring charges like this, even when there are still some atavistic laws on the books. By the way, do you know who the ADA was in Los Angeles who prosecuted Lenny Bruce?
I do.
Johnny Cochran.
Yeah.
He has a very interesting autobiography in which he says ruefully, yes, I was the one, I shouldn't have done it.
Yeah. He was very sort of, what's the word I want, not parenthetically, but just barely involved with the case. But the cop, the undercover cop who busted him on stage at the Troubadour for saying schmuck, was Sherman Block, who later became the sheriff of LA County and remained so until his death last year.
Yes, any questions? Yes.
I'm sure you're familiar with George Carlin's routine about the 7 dirty words. Do you have some
Sorry,
knowledge
Ken.
of the law?
It's a questions about George Carlin's routine on 7 deadly words that you could not say on television.
That's another historic case. Carlin, I think, was very much influenced by Lenny, and like Lenny, he went into etymology. Why are the 7 dirty words, well, whatever they were, cocksucker, shit, whatever, and he did what Lenny used to do. Why these words? Why does it, you know, I wish there was a film of this. Lenny used to, at the Vanguard once in a while, he'd come in, and at the time, that was probably the most integrated audience in New York City, except maybe for jazz clubs. I mean, it transcended race, sexual preference, whatever. Everybody came to hear Lenny. And he'd come in and look around and he'd say, any kikes here tonight?
That is in the show. There's an audio excerpt with photos.
Any niggers, any spics, and the place would freeze. What got into this guy? And then he would do what Carlin later did and said, why are these words so paralyzing? And Carlin did it, and the recording of Carlin's approach to 7 dirty words was heard on WBAI in New York. And a man was in an automobile with his son, who was 15 years old, as I remember, and he found this terribly offensive and wrote a letter to the FCC. The man happened to be an official of morality and media, not the most dispassionate kind of listener. Went up to the Supreme Court, and I think it was a 5-4 decision. It was called Pacifica Radio versus something or other, and it was a very bad First Amendment decision. Brennan was furious. If you want to read an angry dissent, read that one. And I think the man, ironically enough, who wrote the majority decision was John Paul Stevens, who is now the strongest First Amendment justice on the Supreme Court. And that still is, I mean, it's never been overturned, but they don't talk about it. And it's very seldom cited, thank God.
Yeah, there have been cases since Lenny, but a lot of them have to do with either broadcasting or whatever taxpayer funding used. But in Lenny's case, of course, the great irony was that he was in a club where you had to be 21 to get in, and people paid admission to go in specifically to hear him. He wasn't out on a street corner with a megaphone saying four-letter words to little old ladies walking by. You had to be a Lenny fan to, plunk down your $3 to go in and see him. So who was really being victimized?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, questions? How about there in the back?
Yeah, I was wondering what became of Kitty Bruce, his daughter, and I mean, did he have any, ancestors that became comedians, maybe her children? And also, this last female he's involved with says she passed in '97, and you're relatively young. I was wondering, I don't know if it's a drug overdose.
No. First question, Lenny's daughter Kitty is alive. She's living in, I think, Pittston, Pennsylvania.
Right.
Different jobs. She took a crack at showbiz for a while. She was a singer, a pretty good singer. It never really panned out. I think she's works as a nurse. Has not had any children of her own. Lotus Weinstock, who passed away in '97, who was Lenny's girlfriend, in fact engaged to be married to Lenny at the time he died. No, drugs were not involved. She was clean. Brain tumor, her mid-40s.
I wondered ever since I saw the film, what kind of a comedian was she?
She definitely had a touch of Lenny about her. One of the nicest things about this film was it put me in touch with a lot of people whom I grew very close to. And one of the sad things is that some of those people have been taken away. And Lotus and I became very close. I'd go to see her work all the time. And she definitely sort of imbued a social message into her work. You could definitely see Lenny's influence on her. She was devastated by his death. She was much younger than he was. She was in her early 20s when she met Lenny. Lenny was already 40. She was quite devastated, sort of disappeared for a while and then joined a commune. That's where she got the name Lotus. But she was really terrific, as was his mother. Sally, I mean, the interview you saw with Sally, that was shot in 1987. She was already 80 when I shot that. And even at that point, I was in my late 20s, and she would call me up at 11 o'clock at night and say, "What are you doing?" I said, "What am I doing? I'm getting ready for bed." She said, "No, you're not. You're coming. I'm at a club. There's a comic who's coming on. He's great. You have to come see him. He's great. Come on, sit. We'll have dinner. We'll have something to drink." I said, "Sally, I've already taken one shoe off. Put the shoe back on. Get in your car. Come down." She was 80 years old, and she schlepped me out to clubs in the middle of the night. We'd hang out till 2, 3 in the morning, and she was like that up until about the last year when her health started to go. She was really something.
Yes, on the side over there.
I vaguely remember a cartoon, Lenny's voice as the Lone Ranger character.
Yeah.
It wasn't really the Lone Ranger. How did that come about, and who was behind it? Who did they expect to watch it?
It was a routine Lenny did called "Thank You, Masked Man," and he actually loved the radio as a kid. He was always fixed in front of the radio and loved all the comedies and all the drama and all the adventure stuff. And he was actually a big fan of the Lone Ranger. And the routine was basically about the Lone Ranger being selfless and never stopping to hear a thank you, and how Christ-like he was that way, and what would happen if one day he accepted a thank you, and how that would corrupt him to where he would only do things if he could get a thank you, and if he didn't say thank you, he wasn't going to do shit. And so it was a routine that he did, and it was the same guy who filmed the nightclub performance, John Magnuson, a filmmaker in San Francisco, who just struck a deal with Lenny that he would take Lenny's audio recording of this bit and just do some animation to it. And I don't know what kind of use it was put to. I don't know if it had any sort of theatrical run, but it's become sort of a collector's item.
We have a copy of it here in the museum as well.
There you go.
Yes, there.
Do you remember when a couple of years ago the Mothers Against Rock or someone tried to ban certain lyrics of rock music? Do you recall that?
There was the
Tipper Gore, I think.
Oh, yeah, that was the Parents Resource Music Center. Tipper Gore was one of the founders. And one of the things they finally accomplished in doing, they scared the record companies. So record companies had to put the lyrics of some of these songs on the back. And Joan Baez said that at the time, it's a good thing. Some kids will learn to read. But what happened was there were labels. And a lot of the distributors, I forget what the letters were, but if you had a CD, or at that time an LP, that group didn't like, it didn't get distributed. Tipper Gore, since her husband was running for president, has decided that maybe she went too far at that time.
Any questions? Yes, down here.
I love your film because I think it cleared up so many misconceptions about Lenny, but
Thanks.
I was wondering if you could speak about his first bust and your investigation into that in Pennsylvania when he named names.
Philadelphia, yeah. Yeah, I was purposely a little bit nebulous in the narration. I was very careful with the phrasing because I didn't want to say anything that would be proved inaccurate. But essentially, what I do know is this: is that the night before he was busted, he was invited to a party of some sort of prominent, some bigwig in Philadelphia, because Lenny was in town, and even though this wasn't his crowd, he was a celebrity, and rich people like to have celebrities around. So he was invited to this private party, and it wasn't Lenny's scene at all, but he went. I guess there was going to be free booze or something. And he was very uncomfortable, and apparently there was a movement to get him to perform for the group. Come on, Lenny, get up and do something. No, man, thank you, it's cool. I just want to hang out, really. No, come on, Lenny, come on, get up and do something. No, really, I just want to, just hang out, thanks. And they kept pressuring him, and Lenny got upset and either insulted the guy or made some crack about him, or one person said that Lenny in protest urinated on the guy's carpet and then left. In any event, it was the next morning that the hotel room door was broken down. And at the time when they broke down the door, one thing that isn't mentioned is Lenny was also in bed with someone he wasn't supposed to be in bed with. I think it was somebody from the party, possibly the guy's wife, who knows. But in any event, yeah, and then there was the bribe offer, which plenty of people, well, not plenty of people, a couple of key people still alive actually witnessed go down. There's no question about that.
What happened to the judge, the magistrate?
The judge who denied everything, said this never happened, that the guy is a drug addict and he's hallucinating, was eventually disbarred for something and then later committed suicide. So God knows what skeletons he had in his closet. But yeah, you saw the footage right there on camera where Lenny named names, and he was acquitted in Philadelphia because they didn't really have a case. Whether the drugs were being used medically or recreationally, we can only guess, but he did cover himself with prescriptions. So there really was no case. But then it was his next gig in San Francisco less than a week later, and now for the first time he's busted for obscenity. And clearly phone calls were made. I won't go into the evidence I have. Suffice it to say it exists. That phone calls were made saying this SOB got away with it out here, get him there. And that was the beginning of the end, because then it started to snowball. Then he couldn't turn around without getting arrested.
Yes, all the way in the back.
Could you talk a little bit about what the reaction was during the trial in either, his peers, other clubs, other performers and stuff like that?
Did you hear that? That's a good one for you. Sort of the reaction.
What are you referring to?
The New York trial
The New York trial.
in '64. The reaction in terms of how Lenny's peers responded, perhaps other performers, the community in general.
Well, the witnesses for the defense included some, very important literary critics, Richard Gilman and the like. I forget the whole list. The other side had somewhat less, but that wasn't the point. Murtaugh was determined to get a conviction. And because he had this other judge under his thumb, so to speak, and because Ephraim London was thinking on a very higher plane about what he was going to say to the Supreme Court one day, it worked. The reaction in the city, people you'd expect to be on Lenny's side, like Jules Pfeiffer, etc., were there, and morality and media and people like that were on the other side. Catholics that I knew were split. The ones who read a lot of literature by Catholic writers were on Lenny's side.
Well, people have asked me this a few times, and I don't know the answer. Where was the ACLU during this? Were they involved? Were they even...
I don't recall the ACLU being involved, and that's a good question. The ACLU through the years is selective up to a point. I'll give you a current example. The SWAT team that went in to take Elion was there because they got a warrant, not a court order, but a warrant at 7:20 at night, because they didn't want the federal district judge who was handling the case to deal with this. They got a magistrate. The warrant, if you read Lawrence Tribe in the New York Times or Alan Dershowitz in the LA Times was illegal and probably unconstitutional. Larry Tribe, who is not a radical law professor, and his opinions, I mean, his casebook is quoted by the Supreme Court more than that of any other scholar. Tribe said that what they did that night struck at the liberty, was a danger to the liberties of all other Americans. The ACLU only said, gee, we wonder about that. We're waiting to hear from the Justice Department as to whether that there was a need for excessive force. The ACLU can't always be depended on.
Paul Krasner said to me, this is going to make some of you walk out, but Paul Krasner said to me, he always finds the humorous spin. He says, if the ACLU were really consistent, that teacher in Littleton, Colorado, during the shootings, who was huddling under her desk with the students, leading them in prayer, that she should be prosecuted for prayer in school.
Yeah,
so,
violating the establishment clause.
you have to be consistent. Can't play favorites. No walkouts, all right. Sick bunch.
Yes, over here.
I'm a tremendous Lenny fan also,
And he admires your work too, I may add.
Lawrence Schiller, the book that he wrote several years ago. Do you know how fictionalized that
He's asking about Lawrence Schiller, who provided the research for Albert Goldman's book years ago. I've mixed feelings about that book because it is a trove of some hard research. It gets very specific and very anal about
and very
Lenny's,
wrong, by the way.
Well, that's the other side of the coin.
All right, let me tell you about that book. Ralph Gleason was the guy who told me about Lenny first. Ralph wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle, and in a sense, he discovered Lenny. He saw him at the strip clubs. He knew exactly what Lenny was going to be like. Ralph sent me a single-spaced letter of about 19 pages about the factual errors in the first, I think, 50 pages of Goldman's book. I'm in the index. Every reference to me is not true. So that book, I don't know, it shows you, book publishers to this day do not check for accuracy. Lawyers vent the books in case there might be a libel suit, but you can get away with a lot of stuff in books.
Right. A lot of hard research in there, some of it accurate, a lot of inaccurate information. But what I tend to protest on that book is Goldman's interpretations. There are a lot of people who've done things about Lenny who claim to be his friend. Lenny and everybody claims to be his best friend, and they were with him the night before he died. It must have been 3,000 people in that house. A lot of Goldman's interpretations where he took information, even if it was accurate, when he put his own personal spin on Lenny's personality, was just way, way off. So
there is a book coming out, I don't know when. It's going to be the definitive book about Lenny. There's a lawyer named Ronald L.C. Collins in Washington who has transcripts that I never knew existed of practically all the trials and everything else. I think he spent a lot of time with Q, but he's interviewed scores of people. He's a very conscientious guy, happens to be a Lenny fan, which helps. Mm-hmm. And that book, when it comes out, is worth looking at, because that should be the
focus is on, Collins' book, the focus is on the legal, the trials. In fact, it was Collins who informed me that technically Lenny's conviction was, and I didn't mention him by name, but he's the one who's going to work on getting it overturned finally.
Oh, that's good. He's good.
Lenny's own autobiography, by the way, also has to be taken with a grain of salt to the other extent, because he whitewashes a lot of it. Yeah, but it's entertaining.
Yes, all the way over on the side here.
Yeah, I was wondering about how scarce the remaining performance footage of Lenny Bruce really is, because it's very rare to see any new footage around, but I've seen old newspaper ads that suggest that in a couple of years after his death, there were a few different documentary movies floating around. There was one called Dirty Mouth. They tended to play at places like the Bleecker Street Cinema and the Cinema Village. I've never seen any evidence of these movies on tape, but I was wondering if they include any kind of footage that...
Dirty Mouth was not a documentary. It was a narrative film with a comedian named something Travis? Bernie Travis, playing Lenny, and that film was shot. It was put out of business by the producers of the Broadway show Lenny and eventually the motion picture Lenny with Dustin Hoffman as unfair competition, because they didn't get the rights and all of that, so they were shut down and that film never was released. The only other documentary prior to this, to mine, was something that came out in the early 70s that had, again, a lot of the Steve Allen footage, some of the footage from Canada with Nat. There were no interviews. It's really nothing that wasn't fairly accessible. Lenny, that's the one I'm talking about, yeah, which is primarily a compilation of performance clips with some newsreel stock footage and that sort of thing.
The movie was interesting. Dustin Hoffman, obviously, is a first-class actor. He did a lot of research. He interviewed me and a whole lot of other people, but he didn't make it. And somebody said that you either have it or you don't. And he was a conscientious guy, but he didn't have that wildness, I guess, that spirit that Lenny had.
A friend of mine met Hoffman recently and mentioned that his friend had made this HBO documentary on Lenny Bruce, and he said, Dustin looked at him and said, geez, I wish I'd seen that film before I played the part.
Yeah.
He had eventually seen it, but wished he had seen it 20 years ago.
We have time for one more question. Yes, this person in the back has had their hand up for a while. Yes.
Yeah, there was the Steve Allen monologue that he did. I saw something in the museum here where afterwards he takes Q&A from the audience, and he gives his definition of sort of like what to respond to the term sick comedian. And it was really great, and I was wondering why you decided not to put that into your documentary.
Because my documentary was 90 minutes long. I mean, that was the clip that I found, and there are excerpts from that in this film. But then to get into the Q&A thing, I mean, part of structuring a film like this is you just can't use everything, and you have a story to tell. And the question for any clip you use is, does this advance the story? And by the time I got to that point in Lenny's life in '64, I really sort of had to stay on the track of the trial and what happened with the trial, so I couldn't at that point go to a...
In the museum here, there was a footnote that said that was never aired. I want to know, what was Steve Allen's whole thing with that? Was he indifferent to that? Was he supportive? Or was he...
No, he's talking about the 1964 clip that I actually unearthed and excerpted in here. Steve Allen's book, Funny People, he has a chapter on Lenny Bruce, and he talks about this appearance. And Lenny did some religious material, that whole thing about going in front of a synagogue and singing about pork, and why we left England several hundred years ago. We were Protestants, and the Bible and all that. That didn't bug the censors. What bugged them was his use of the word snot. That just made them crazy. Well, we can't put that on TV. There'll be riots in the streets, and people will overthrow the government if they hear snot on TV. So it was shelved. I mean, literally just shelved, and Lenny got the phone call saying, and Steve Allen felt terrible about it, but, you have sponsors and people who pay the bills, and you have to answer to them. And so Steve felt terrible about it, but called up Lenny and said, they're not going to air the piece. And Lenny just said, oh, that's cool. That's all right. Don't worry about it. And then it was missing for years and years and years. And Steve Allen in his book talks about how much he regretted that this thing will never be seen by anybody, even though he felt it wasn't Lenny at his best. And then I wound up finding it at the UCLA archives in Los Angeles, sort of unmarked, just a kinescope, and I checked the date, and the date matched with what I had in my research for Lenny's appearance, and they put it up for me, and there it was. And I called up Steve Allen, and I said, I found the missing clip. So the museum here now has the full appearance. But it's wild, because you look at the talk shows now, when they do have comedians on, you get up, you do your 3 minutes. Lenny, the monologue must have been 15 minutes, and then Steve Allen interviewed him on the dais for another 10 minutes, and then Lenny took questions from the audience for another 10 minutes. It was a half hour of unseen footage.
A footnote about Steve Allen, whom I knew quite well, he was courageous to put Lenny on the air at all. And he was really a paladin of First Amendment free expression all these years until, if you've seen those full-page newspaper ads, he has become a convert to the essence of morality in media. And he makes Bill Bennett sound benign when he attacks all this terrible stuff that's in the media. I don't know what caused the conversion, but it shows that not everybody remains consistent.
I'll say on his behalf, only because he and I have talked about it, that he doesn't see it as a contradiction, because he thinks people should be allowed to say or perform whatever they want. His specific bug is what's allowed on television now, where children have access, and that influence. That's his, I'm not defending him or going against him one way or another, but that would be his response to that, that's his concern, is what's available.
Yeah, but children have access to magazines, children have access to the internet, and the reason John Paul Stevens wrote that horrible decision in the Pacifica case was he said, After all, it was on radio, and children can listen to the radio. So, you know, I like Steve, but he's wrong. Because once you start cutting or making exceptions to First Amendment freedoms, then you hit the slippery slope.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank Bob Weide and Nat Hentoff for joining us this evening.